We're here tonight to welcome our special guest, who of course is the host of Special Report, the one and only Bret Baier. So you are all in for a very special treat. To introduce Bret tonight, it is my pleasure to welcome Christopher Nixon Cox, who is the grandson of President and Mrs. Nixon. He is the vice chairman of Bright Sphere and a non-resident fellow at the Liechtenstein Institute at Princeton University. Would you please welcome Christopher Nixon Cox?
Well, hello, all Nixon fans. Great to see you tonight. Welcome to the Nixon Library. This is a wonderful and historic night to have Bret Baier back with us. I'm so excited to hear what he has to say, but for you baseball fans out there, and Bret, wherever you are, I know this is for you, 3-2 Nats. We'll probably get some updates as the night goes on. First of all, I just want to say, for all you veterans out there, if you could just please raise your hands, because I want to give you all a round of applause. Thank you for your service. We wouldn't have our freedom if it weren't for what you've done for the country, so thank you very much. And also, I think as we see the devastation that has been wrought by the fires across California, we should also thank our first responders and also our police officers. And our police officers for everything they do to keep us safe every day in our communities and to protect us against all threats. So thank you very much to all of them. So let's get on to the main event. Bret Baier is back at the Nixon Library. I couldn't be more excited. Bret hardly needs an introduction, but Bret started at Fox News in 1998. In 2001, on September 11th, he drove from Atlanta, where he was the bureau chief, up to Washington to cover the 9/11 attacks and the damage that had wrought on our nation's capital in New York. And then he very quickly became the chief Pentagon correspondent for Fox News. He held that position for a few years until 2007, when he took over as chief White House correspondent, and then very quickly ascended the ladder to take over for Bret Hume at Special Report, a position he holds to this day. Actually, if you think about it, Bret took over that position. I think he was 39 years old, which makes him younger than me. My God, that is fantastic. What a meteoric rise. But also, Bret is an author of 3 best-selling books. Notice there's going to be a trend here. 3 books, 3 days in January, about the Eisenhower administration and Eisenhower's farewell address. 3 days in Moscow, about the Reagan administration and his summitry with the Soviet Union. And then, of course, the book that we all are so lucky to experience tonight, 3 Days at the Brink. And that's exactly what we're here tonight to hear about, which is about the Roosevelt administration and World War II and the summit in Tehran. Now, I know we have a theory of 3 here, but President Nixon went to China for the week that changed the world. Now, that's 7 days. But maybe for his next book, Bret could make an exception and do a book on President Nixon, 7 days that changed the world. Just a thought, Bret. I wasn't ever good at math, so I think 7 sounds fine to me. I actually had the privilege of reading Bret's book, which just came out. I had the privilege of reading it, and I'm a student of history. I'm not a math guy. I'm a student of history, and this is really a wonderful work of history. It delves deeply into Franklin Delano Roosevelt, into the different players on the world scene. And when you think of what FDR went through, there were quite some amazing players that he worked with and that he experienced. Woodrow Wilson, Edith Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's wife, William Jennings Bryan, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill. It was quite a cast of characters that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to work with and deal with. And Bret gets into all these different individuals and what drove them and their backgrounds and their personal stories. And it really makes the history come to life. I also really love how Bret gets into the history of Asia. He talks about Japan, and we can see how the Japanese Empire emerged as the first Asian nation to defeat a European nation at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, continued its expansion through the Ryukyu Islands, ultimately going into Indochina and eventually coming to a peak of their expansion when they attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. And we can see this through Roosevelt's eyes, because Roosevelt lived through that whole time. That's an amazing part of the book, and it shows how the book spans so many different parts of the world and what a fascinating history it covers. And then it also gets into such wonderful little stories. There's a little story about when Joe Kennedy was replaced as ambassador to the UK in 1941. In fact, he was called Jittery Joe, which shows that President Trump doesn't have a monopoly on nicknames. But he was replaced by John Gilbert Wynant. And it talked about how Wynant, during the bombing of London, would walk around the streets of London while London was being bombed, and how his bravery inspired the British people to have an even more resolute response to the Nazi threat. So they're wonderful little stories of both big and small personalities that make this a wonderful historical read. But more importantly, they're tremendous themes. There's the theme of family, of mothers and sons. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an only child. His mother doted on him until he went away to Groton, a boarding school, when he was 14 years old. And then even while he was in boarding school, his mother would take a ladder and climb over a fence just to be close to him and look at him. I mean, it's just these wonderful stories. That's maybe a little strange, but shows how much she doted on him. These are wonderful little stories that come out. So you could imagine how she felt when Franklin married Eleanor. This very much rocked her world, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's mother really never left his side, and the relationship between Eleanor and his mother was a fascinating one. The relationship between Franklin and Eleanor was fascinating. In fact, imagine this, you men in the audience who are married, imagine this, when Franklin Roosevelt announced he was running for president, he actually didn't tell Eleanor about his plans until after he announced running for president. That would be an awkward conversation at the dinner table, and I think you married men know what I'm talking about there. That would be quite an awkward conversation. So there's a wonderful familial theme that runs through the book. But then I think there are two themes that are very important to policymaking today. One is the importance of U.S. military power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was an internationalist, and he believed that the United States needed to have a strong Navy. He loved the Navy to project its power around the world. This is a theme that he fought for in the Wilson administration against William Jennings Bryan. He proved correct. He fought for it while he was president, and he was proved correct again that the United States needed to modernize its military to fight the Nazi threat. And this is something that is so important today even. I read an article today that China is giving almost $1 billion to Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands to rebuild their wharfs and other infrastructure on that island. This shows how important it is that we maintain a strong posture of keeping our holdings in the Pacific Islands, because that is how we can project power throughout the Pacific and protect our homeland. So this is a very important theme that Bret touches on. But even more important is what Bret talks about, the importance of communication. And this is what Roosevelt did at the conference in Tehran. He communicated with our people who we didn't necessarily agree with, Joseph Stalin. He had many disagreements: communism versus capitalism, freedom versus totalitarianism. However, it was in the national interest of the United States to talk to Joseph Stalin, to come up with solutions that could take on the Nazi threat. And that's what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did at Tehran. And if you look through history, whether it's Roosevelt talking to Stalin, my grandfather, President Nixon, going to Beijing to meet with Mao, Reagan talking to the Soviets in the 1980s, and of course, President Trump reaching out to people of varying stripes across the world, whether it's Kim Jong-un or others, to advance the national interest. This is the only way that we can solve our problems. It is a great lesson for today. But yet, I don't want to steal Bret's thunder. I don't want to steal it at all. So we must move on to the main course. So tonight, I'd like to present you with our honored guest and featured speaker, Bret Baier.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Chris, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for reading the book so intently. And ladies and gentlemen, good night. You can see, this guy reads and comprehends. That was literally a great encapsulation of some of the stuff inside this book. It is great to be back here in the East Room of the White House. There is nothing like this venue to talk to folks. I did my show out of here today, special report, and it was fair, balanced, unafraid. But it was a real privilege to do out of here, and I mentioned numerous times that I was in Yorba Linda at the Nixon Library Museum. I was talking to somebody downstairs, and they said, you know, the Reagan Library was all over the news with all the fires, which are horrific, but, you know, every time they were out on the news, they were saying the Reagan Library is in Simi Valley, and someone downstairs said, you know, we need to do something to make sure our name is out there too. I don't suggest lighting any fires around the library. This is a horrific thing, and I really appreciate people coming out tonight, dealing with all of the traffic and everything else to get out here. So thank you for being here. Covering Washington, I'll talk about that towards the end. I want to talk about the book, and then I want to open it up for questions. Any questions you have, I will answer or not answer as well as I can. I like to say that I am one tweet away from changing my entire show, which often happens right before 6 p.m., so we can talk a little bit about that. Importantly, it is 3-2 at the top of the seventh inning. The Nats are 1 out, 2 men on base. Charles Krauthammer is smiling down from the upper deck. Obviously a dear, dear friend, and I took my kids to a World Series game on Saturday, and we, up in the seventh inning, we went up and sat next to Daniel Krauthammer, Charles' son, who was at the game. He has kept his dad's seats, and he was at the game by himself with an open seat next to him in honor of his dad, so who's the ultimate Nationals fan. So I'm pulling for the Nats pretty hard right now. I want to talk to you about this book, how I kind of got here, the journey that I took, and answer some of the questions I get. The main question I get is, why do you do this? Don't you have enough to do? And the answer is yes, I do have enough to do. But I really love this uncovering of history, like unearthing nuggets of history that, as Chris mentioned, really do breathe life into parts of history that sometimes we forget. I think, personally, that civics is getting lost in our culture, in our kids' education, in what we talk about every day. Even lawmakers on Capitol Hill could stand to take a history lesson or two about where we've been and where we may be going. So I've been here now. This is the third time talking about these books. It started out, this journey, with the Eisenhower book. And I told this story before, but in case you weren't here, I had an invite to Augusta National. I'm a golfer. I played golf in college. I'm a 3 handicap, but I'm a giving 3. I'm a walking wallet, essentially, with all my friends. But I got the invite of invites to go to Augusta National, and I stayed in the Eisenhower cabin on property. And I was really jacked up to play that first round, and I poured myself a glass of wine or 3 and walked around the Eisenhower cabin and really fell in love with just finding out about President Eisenhower. I'd known about General Eisenhower, but here I am covering Washington and politics, and I didn't really know about President Eisenhower. So I set out after that trip to go to Abilene, Kansas, to the Presidential Library, and determined that that's what I really wanted to do, was to introduce President Eisenhower to my generation and younger particularly, who may not know him. I asked the people at the library what I should focus on. Tons of books that have been written about him. And they said the farewell address and the last 3 days of his administration. A lot of people think about the military-industrial complex speech, but there's a lot more in that speech And there's a lot more to what he thought about planning for that speech. So I really set in to do it. I hired a researcher who happened to be a former mayor of a neighboring town in Salina, Kansas, little town next to Abilene. Her name is Sydney Soderberg. And I met her and I said, I hear you're the best researcher they have. And she said, yes, I am. I said, this is going to be good. She said, I have to tell you a few things. I said, okay. She said, one, I watch your show. And I thought, that's a good start. Thank you. She said, I like your show. That's even better. I have to tell you, though, I am a true blue Democrat. I bleed blue. And I said, well, that's okay. You and I are going to work together. You're the best researcher, and I'm a news guy, and I'm aspiring to be a reporter of history. So she set out to dig into this to find nuggets. And I'm talking things that had not been uncovered or unearthed before, oral histories that hadn't been out about Eisenhower, declassified documents about Eisenhower, your grandfather, other things that are in that book that had never been out. And we strung it together with my great co-author, Catherine Whitney, and she and I bounced back and forth at night. I write at night. She changed her schedule so we could real-time ping-pong back and forth, chapters and paragraphs. And it worked. The formula worked. Looking through a soda straw at those 3 days in a narrative form, and then bouncing and showing how this leader gets to that moment. So that book went to number 2, and I thought, there's got to be another 3 days. Someplace. So I sent Sydney to Simi Valley, and I essentially got her an apartment, and she hung out at the Reagan Library and dug in some more and unearthed another really consequential 3 days that history didn't remember that much, and that is a speech that Ronald Reagan delivers at Moscow State University to Soviet kids in the final summit as he's meeting with Mikhail Gorbachev. And that 3 days and the interpersonal relationships between Reagan and Gorbachev and the other aides really was dramatic. And then I bounce back and show how Reagan gets there. So like the Star Wars movies, I decided to go back to the beginning because that book made it to number 1. And I said, I think we've got something here. So I went back and looked for 3 days that history maybe didn't remember, didn't focus on, that was consequential for the beginning of the Cold War. Eisenhower is obviously the middle, the heat of the Cold War as he's fighting the Soviets. Reagan wrapping up with the diplomatic dance with Gorbachev, the end of the Cold War. The beginning of the Cold War is the end of World War II, where Stalin is emboldened and moves through Eastern Europe. The reason that happens, part of the reason, is because of what happened to end the war. And that is this: 3 days at the brink, FDR's daring gamble to win World War II. It's the Tehran Conference in 1943, November. It is at the brink because people forget that we could have lost World War II. And you look back and you think the big battles and it was just destined to happen. Well, it didn't always have to be that way. In fact, Hitler was on the march in Western Europe. The Nazis had gone into the Mediterranean. They had invaded the Soviet Union in Stalingrad. They had taken a loss there, but the Red Army lost 1 million+ soldiers in the Battle of Stalingrad. At that point, FDR and Churchill decide they need to get Stalin on their side to break the back of the Nazis and to win the war. And that is the backdrop for this book. So I sent Sydney to Hyde Park, spent a ton of time in Hyde Park at the FDR Library, the Churchill papers in London, and even Stalin's diaries from Moscow. And what is in here are oral histories and nuggets. Some of them have never been out before, and stories that breathe life into this moment. Now, the characters in this book are real people. We look back oftentimes and think of these leaders as superheroes, but they're all flawed humans. They all have different traits, the good, the bad. Churchill was a very emotional guy. His aides said he cried once a day about something or another. And he made his feelings clear. He was very passionate. You know, Churchill and Great Britain were fighting the Nazis on their own at the beginning. And he was begging FDR and the U.S. to get into the war against Germany. After World War I, Congress had actually passed a law that tied the hands of the administration from even offering assistance. And Churchill wrote that he always felt like a jilted lover. No one knew the whims of trying to get the jilted lover, FDR, to get involved in the war other than me, he said. But he kept on trying, not successfully, but he kept on trying to establish this relationship. Pearl Harbor happens, obviously, December 7th, 1941, and the U.S. is drawn into the war. Germany actually declares war on the U.S. before the U.S. Gets into the war officially. But the U.S. is in. Churchill could not have been happier of that, not because of the loss of Pearl Harbor, but finally he had gotten his ally and friend to commit to fight this battle and this war. So Churchill goes to the White House at the end of 1941, December, and he's larger-than-life figure walking the halls of the White House and, smokes cigars, drinks scotch. They have long talks about how they're going to end the war. They determine that they need Stalin, and Churchill says, "No one can say that anyone's been against communism as much as I have over the last 25 years. However, if Hitler was going to invade the gates of hell, I would at least have to say a positive thing about the devil on the House of Commons floor." I don't get to do that much on the show. The way they talked was just amazing. And it's all kind of documented. In this meeting at the White House in 1941, they're also talking about not only winning the war, but the post-war. FDR is obsessed with what that's going to look like after they beat Hitler, understanding that they might not beat Hitler because there are moments that they've had some losses, and the Nazis are still very strong. But they're talking about a post-war organization of nations that fights fascism. And they're on the back porch of overlooking the south portico of the White House. FDR's drink is a dry martini. He smokes cigarettes. You remember that picture of him in the convertible with the long cigarette, the jaunty pose? He smoked a lot of those. Churchill has big, thick cigars with a glass of scotch, and they're sitting there arguing about what the post-war world is going to look like late into the night and what they're going to call it. So they both go to bed, and FDR gets an idea, and he rolls down in his wheelchair, rolls down the hallway, and he bursts into Churchill's room and says, Winston, I have it. We are going to call it the United Nations." And at that moment, Churchill had just gotten out of the shower, and he was in the room stark naked, dripping. And FDR is profusely apologizing. "I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry." And naked in the White House, dripping wet, he says, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing that he will not share with the President of the United States." And that is actually the moment that they decide to call it the United Nations. I didn't mean to give you that image of a naked Churchill, but it is a true story. They determined that they need to have this one-on-one meeting with Stalin. Stalingrad, the massive battle, strategically, Hitler makes a huge mistake by invading the Soviet Union. The Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact with Germany at the beginning of World War II. And that was FDR and Churchill's biggest fear, is that Stalin would choose to essentially side with the Germans and stay out of the war. Hitler disregards the non-aggression pact. He invades the Soviet Union, and the Red Army takes, again, more than 1 million soldiers. 1 million soldiers lost. That's like a city in the U.S. killed in a battle with the Nazis. They continue to fight, and that is what draws the Soviet Union into the war. But FDR and Churchill are very concerned that there still might, even though there might be a turn, and Stalin might agree to side with Hitler again. So they start courting him for a one-on-one meeting. They want to invite him to different places, but Stalin is adamant that the meeting has to happen in Tehran. Well, that's 6,000 miles away for FDR. It's a long trip for Churchill, too. And they go back and forth with letters trying to court him, saying, you understand that I have a constitutional government, a Congress that I have to be near. Churchill says, I have parliament that I have to deal with. But Stalin knows that he holds the cards, and he demands that Tehran is the place. So they agree, and they set it up for November 1943. Now, it's a challenge to get over there. It's not like you hop on Air Force One and you just pop over there. This is, number one, a very dangerous time. There are U-boat infested waters. The Germans had submarines all over the place, just off the coast of the U.S. And so they set out to make this a secret meeting. FDR only tells a few aides that he's actually doing it, and the press has no clue. He tells the press that he's going on a presidential fishing trip. And he gets on the presidential yacht, the Potomac. And the Potomac then meets up with the newest naval battleship in the U.S. Navy, the USS Iowa. The Iowa has been configured specially for FDR and his wheelchair. They have an elevator, kind of a lift, that lifts him up off the Potomac onto the USS Iowa. They have captain's quarters that is specifically has ramps and a bathtub that he's able to use with his wheelchair. And he brings his aides and the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff on this trip across the ocean to Tehran. He has a flotilla of ships. He's got a destroyer and a frigate, and they are going over. While they're going over, they don't experience any U-boats, but they want to show the commander-in-chief what they would do had they seen any U-boats in the water. So they do an exercise. FDR is out on the veranda on the USS Iowa, and they start doing this exercise, and they're simulating what it would be like to launch a torpedo. However, the Navy destroyer, the USS William S. Porter, there is a firing mechanism inside one of the torpedo tubes, and they accidentally fire a real torpedo at the USS Iowa. So they break radio silence and say, this is not a drill, this is not a drill. And the USS Iowa captain sees the torpedo heading towards the USS Iowa. He turns the battleship towards the torpedo. It barely misses and explodes 1,000 feet off of the bow. And FDR is on the veranda, and he's, oh, that is wonderful. Wonderful job. Fantastic job. Meanwhile, the crew is just sweating because the 32nd president of the United States could have gone down in this torpedo strike by friendly fire, as well as all of his Joint Chiefs of Staff, including General Marshall, who happens to factor in a little bit later in world mapping. But that's a story that I never knew in the history books. I didn't know that happened, but Sydney, got the whole story. I actually went out to the USS Iowa. I talked to some of the guys who were on the ship at that time, 95 years old, remember it like it was yesterday, and walked around exactly where he was on that veranda when he's applauding the torpedo exploding. So I like to say that I'm breaking news about World War II. It's a Fox News alert. They finally make it over, and to Chris's point, they make a stop in Cairo, and they meet with General Chiang Kai-shek of China. FDR believes that Asia is going to be crucial in the post-war world. So Churchill, FDR, and Chiang Kai-shek meet in Cairo. FDR believes that it's going to be the four policemen, the Soviet Union, China, Great Britain, and the U.S., that will be kind of the overseers of this organization of the United Nations. They make it from Cairo, plane flight over to Tehran. While they do, intelligence picks up real assassination plots by the Nazis that they're going to drop in and parachute in assassins dressed as Red Army soldiers to try to kill the big three leaders as they meet. Churchill isn't buying it. He thinks it's a bunch of bull because the Soviets want to move all of the conference into the Soviet embassy. The U.S. buys it, says the intel's probably pretty good, and they're not going to take the risk. So the president, FDR, is at the U.S. Embassy. They get a motorcade, a long motorcade. They put a fake FDR, looks like FDR, on the back of the motorcade. They send it this way. FDR goes in a regular car by himself in the back, laying down to the Soviet embassy. All of them arrive there and are met by Stalin, who FDR describes as 5'6" and a man strewn out of granite, that he was just a solid man with cold eyes, cold blue eyes, like a stiff martini, FDR says. As he gets there, all the staff is there in the butler uniforms and maid uniforms, and as they're going to their different rooms, they notice that the staff have bulges in the side of their uniforms, all of them, where the Lugers are. Basically, they were all secret police for Stalin. The U.S. intel folks tell FDR that they know each one of the rooms is bugged, and that the Soviets are listening. Whenever FDR and his staff are talking about anything sensitive, suddenly someone will pop up out of the blue. Sometimes it's Stalin to say, "How is everything? Everything good?" when they're talking about some sensitive thing. Churchill handled it a lot differently. He knew that there were bugs, and he would walk into the rooms and say, "Oh, the Soviets are so bothersome. Oh, they're horrible people. Very horrible people." Anyway. You should hear my Trump. So the conference goes on, and one of the things that FDR is trying to do is to convince Stalin that Churchill and FDR are not ganging up on him. They want to he wants to make sure, and this is a real thought process in Stalin's head, because he believes that Churchill and FDR are trying to weaken the Soviet Union and kind of beat him down, and then kind of prevent him from his ambitious goal, which is the spread of communism throughout the world, starting with Eastern Europe. FDR senses this and comes up with a strategy that essentially he's going to throw Churchill under the bus in the entire conference. And he does this. He does it in almost every meeting. Sometimes starting before a dinner, he'll say, "Winston, I hope you forgive me for what I'm about to do." And then would spend the entire dinner making fun of Churchill with Stalin at Churchill's expense. Well, Churchill stormed out of numerous meetings and dinners because he was so emotional about getting made fun of. But Stalin loved it and would join in the joke about Churchill. And FDR's goal of establishing this relationship was ultimately reached. In that meeting, they plan Operation Overlord, which we now know as D-Day. That conference doesn't happen. That planning doesn't happen. That logistical feat of D-Day doesn't happen. And we might all be speaking German. I mean, I'm joking, but it would have changed the entire course of the world. Churchill is not convinced that it's the right thing to do, doesn't think the Allies are ready. He wants to focus on the Mediterranean, make sure that the armies can handle it. But Stalin is adamant that they have to have a cross-channel invasion of France. and FDR goes along. After that meeting, they sign a pact that they're going to do it, and there's this picture of them on the front of the Soviet embassy. He comes back, FDR does, and gives a speech and says, "We have a plan going forward," and that starts the planning, where he names General Dwight D. Eisenhower as the commanding officer of Operation Overlord. The logistics behind that and what was able to be pulled off and what could have gone wrong is pretty amazing. The book starts actually on the 75th anniversary of D-Day with President Trump delivering that speech and the world leaders embracing that moment and turning to the veterans who are gathered there. One of the best parts of this process has been talking to veterans who were there and to be able to get their perspectives. And the section on D-Day is pretty detailed about the effort to get on those beaches. So the dedication to the book says, "To the veterans of World War II and D-Day who died on the beaches of Normandy, and to those who are still living today, thank you for your service, your sacrifice, and for saving the world." And I truly mean that, because had that not happened, it would be a different place. After that, they have the success, and the war starts to turn, and obviously leads to the beginning of the end of World War II. The concessions made to Stalin at the Tehran Conference, and then the Yalta Conference, which is much more familiar to people as you think about conferences from World War II. The concessions made there really were significant. Stalin had major ambitions about the future of communism and what he thought he was going to do. And the promises he makes to FDR and Churchill evaporate. Why? Because Tehran made FDR sick. Yalta killed him. He had to travel 5 hours over a mountain range in an open-air Jeep to get to Yalta. He gets really ill, and you can see it. He travels back to the U.S., and a short time later, in Georgia, he dies at Warm Springs. At the same time, Churchill loses his election in Great Britain. So the leaders who had negotiated all of this were no longer there, and in that vacuum, Stalin steps into a bold move, had already invaded Poland, and expands through Eastern Europe, and that is the beginning of the Cold War, that for president after president, including your grandfather, had to deal with for years and years to come, until Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev make significant headway, and then George H.W. Bush sees really the end of that with the wall coming down during his administration. One of the things I love about this process is to be able to, like I said, go back and show leaders how they get there. FDR was a wealthy young boy. Chris described it. His mother was doting on him every second. He was the golden child. They didn't need for anything. They both families were very wealthy. Hyde Park, the house you can still go to and visit, is a mansion, and the property is gorgeous. He aspired to be a politician like Teddy Roosevelt. He was just not that good. He was kind of vanilla. He couldn't identify with folks. And what changes him is the crisis of being felled by polio. At 39 years old, he's hit by polio. He loses the use of his legs. He never stops trying to walk again. He would strap on metal braces on his legs and try to pull himself down the driveway in Hyde Park, but he would never succeed. And that moment changes him. That trial changes him. Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian, said that his gifts of leadership come from that trial, the ability to then have empathy for people who are going through tough times. George Will, the columnist, writes, "When the iron of those braces hit his legs, the steel was infused in his soul." And it's really a moment. If you look at other presidents, President Eisenhower came from not a lot, tough time in Abilene. President Reagan comes from not a lot, and alcoholic father. That was his trial, FDR's trial. And it changes him. He has this love affair with Eleanor at the beginning. They decide that they are together. It really infuriates his mother, Sarah. But yet they stay together. He's a little amorous with other women, including eventually Eleanor's assistant, Lucy Mercer, who he has an affair with. She never really gets over that, but becomes independent as a first lady and really comes into her own when they finally take the White House. So much so that she likes to travel around the Northeast to different projects and work projects, union halls, prisons, homeless shelters, and she likes to do it by herself. And she said to the Secret Service, "I don't want Secret Service." And the Secret Service said, "Madam First Lady, you have to have Secret Service or you have to have a gun." And she said, "I'll take the gun." So she went to training, she shot, and they gave her a pistol that she put in her convertible in the glove compartment. It was the first and last First Lady who was pistol packing, Eleanor Roosevelt. As she bounced around, sometimes she would just do it on her own, just bounce someplace, and FDR, the president, called her assistant one day and said, "Where is Eleanor? I'm trying to get her. Where is Eleanor?" And she said, "Well, Mr. President, she's in prison." And he said, "Well, that's not a surprise, but what's she there for?" So, good little moments there. I think the process, what was most important to me, was seeing how important it was to reach out and talk to enemies, to allies, to continue the conversation. Chris hit it well, but I think that each one of these books, I have come to the conclusion that all of these leaders really decided that that was the most important element, is that if you're talking, you're not fighting. If you're talking, there's a possible solution in the making. And I think that each president has an example of what that possibly looks like. Obviously, President Nixon, with his outreach to China, and what happens in those 7 days really changes the perspective about where the U.S.-China relationship was going to be. The nuggets that I get from this research I think is really important, and it's the breadth of changing the moment that I think people can suddenly see history as not just a history book, but as our history and what we can remember as a country about where we've been. Which is why, as this book comes out, I have a young reader's edition for 8 to 14-year-olds. And my two sons, 12 and 9, Paul and Daniel, thank you. So Paul and Daniel have told me that they're reading this book. I really hope they are reading it, as they say. But it makes it digestible. I was at the Reagan Library last night, I said that, and a guy came up to me and said that his son's 7th grade teacher is now doing a 3 days class with the Young Readers editions of all 3 books. So doing FDR, Eisenhower, and Reagan. And so I'm going to make an appearance in that class, and I'm going to go talk to those kids and hopefully get some young historians in the making. All right, so here's what I would love to do. What would be huge, if you all give me some big questions Now, I don't want any problems. Just big, fair questions. Huge. I'll answer them. Maybe I won't. I don't get to do that on the show either. But we have some questions, I think, that I can take right now.
Yes, you've mentioned several interesting facts. What was the biggest surprise for you in researching this book and writing it?
The biggest surprise, I think, for me was the length to which FDR went to court Stalin. And he was willing to give a ton. He was willing to throw Churchill under the bus. He was willing to do a lot to make sure Stalin was on board. I also think what was surprising to me was, I mentioned that we look back at figures and we think that they're superheroes, but they are flawed humans as well. And at the end of his presidency, and remember, he was elected 4 times, the only president to be elected 4 times in our country, that while being confident and optimistic and could communicate very well, especially at the end of his terms, FDR had a bit of a God complex, like he alone could figure out the way forward for America, that he alone could contain and corral Stalin, even though he knew that he was a really bad guy who murdered a lot of his own people and had big ambitions for communism, that FDR alone could do that. But after Yalta, when he comes home and obviously dies, no one else is in the circle of trust that FDR has let in. In fact, Truman at the time doesn't even know about the Manhattan Project that he eventually uses to end the war in Japan. He doesn't know that the U.S. is working on this because he was never in FDR's inner circle. So Stalin, because he's not there, Stalin is emboldened and does what he does in Eastern Europe.
We're going to veer a little bit away from the subject because people want to ask some things that are happening today, of course. The son of Joe Biden was sitting on a Ukrainian business board appropriate, and was there quid pro quo?
So in the Tehran Conference, there is a wonderful moment. You can ask the question whether it was illegal what transpired, but you cannot defend whether it was inappropriate or it didn't look bad. That's the not defensible part, because it did look bad. And even the Obama administration at the time expressed concerns about it. So I think there is a difference. You know, when people talk about it, and they always cover this and say, and there's no evidence that anything illegal happened. Well, okay, well, let's make that judgment. But you can definitively say that it wasn't kosher, it wasn't good, was it? It wasn't like, here is the guy in charge of Ukraine policy running the show, and his son is operating with this company, and the prosecutor who's going after the company is removed by the guy who's running Ukraine policy. It doesn't look good. So I think that that's the differential when we have to talk about it. I do think that there's more to all of these stories that may be coming out soon. How soon, I don't know. This may be a question later, but I'll tackle it now. There are 2 tracks here that are happening at the same time. There's an impeachment track, an inquiry that's going to be voted on tomorrow that likely will go through, and House Democrats are laying the process by which they get the votes in articles of impeachment. That's the one track. The other track is the investigation of the investigators, the IG report that is, I'm told, was supposed to come out before tomorrow. I don't know if it's going to come out this week or not. But once it does, then the other investigation, which is the Durham investigation at the beginning of the Trump probe, also starts to come out after the IG comes out. So there's like a race of 2 trains on a track, and they're trying to get to the finish line. And we're going to see in Washington this collision course of explaining both of those things at once. And the trouble for some news organizations is that they've never explained this one. So they're going to have to start from scratch or try to discount it entirely and say it's a complete conspiracy theory. From a guy who's been appointed by 2 Democratic attorneys general in Connecticut, the U.S. Attorney John Durham. So those are 2 things, and I'm just trying to cover them both fairly, and you all decide what you think about them.
We have an update on the World Series.
Yes?
It's the bottom of the 8th, and the Nationals are up 4-2.
Oh. Come on.
And I think Christopher might have a
Can we top of the ninth? 4-2.
4-2.
Oh, getting goosebumps up here. Man, oh man. Let's take a moment and pump in ESPN. You got it right there? Okay, top of the ninth. Excellent. All right.
Talk about some of the other presidents that you admire and why.
Yeah. Well, I covered George W. Bush, 43, in a very, very difficult time for the nation in 9/11. And he was never good at the podium and never really in his own skin talking to reporters publicly at the briefing room or in a press conference. But when we would talk off the record, and all of the White House pool or the reporters who were covering him went up to the residence and had off-the-record discussions, I left those discussions with people from NBC and ABC and CBS with these reporters saying, is that the same guy? He's really good. He knows his stuff. He's very comfortable. And I don't know what the differential was, but I do know that he had this internal ability to discount what the polls said and make a decision based on what he thought was right. So I think that whether you agreed with the decisions or not that were made, I think that there was a high level of integrity, and I was always impressed with George W. Bush, especially behind the scenes. Now, if you see him at these events where he gets paid to come in and does Q&A, it's like the guy he's very comfortable in his own skin. He's painting, he's having fun, and so it's good to see.
I'll throw you a softball. Is there any chance that Daniel Krauthammer could be on your panel occasionally?
That is a great question, and I'm trying to recruit him currently to be on my panel. Charles was my first baseman on my panel. When I took over for Britt Hume, January 9th, 2009, January 5th, 2009, my then boss, Roger Ailes, said to me, how are you going to do the panel? And I said, well, I'm not sure what the rotation will be, but I would really like to have Charles on every night. And he said, every night? How about 4 nights and make him want a night? And I said, I think we need to have him every single night that we can have him. And it proved to be that he obviously was whenever he talked, it was a verbal op-ed. I mean, everything that he said was just got to the heart of a matter. He cut through all the noise in D.C. and got to kind of the heart of it. And sometimes you didn't know how he was going to answer something. But you knew it was going to be witty, and he had a beautiful sense of humor. I am trying to recruit Daniel, but I'll tell you a quick story. Charles used to go to Nats games right after the panel, and he timed it that it was 8 minutes from the panel to the Nats Stadium where his parking space was. Now remember, he's a quadriplegic, so he has the specialized van that is built just for him, and he invites me to come to the Nats game one day. So I come down to the parking lot with him, and he pushes the button, and the thing comes down, and we roll up, and I get in the passenger seat, and it is like the Star Trek Enterprise. I mean, it's got all kinds of buttons. He has one wheel that he controls the driving of the wheel. He's got something in his mouth that does the speed, and then he has another thing in his mouth that pushes like buttons that do different things in the car. So as we're driving there, and again, it's only 8 minutes, but he's driving, and he's got all this stuff going on, and he turns to me, he says, are you hot? Are you hot at all? And I'm like, no, I'm good. I am perfectly fine. Meanwhile, I'm like dripping sweat, you know, like, but I miss him terribly every day. So I'm trying desperately to get Daniel on the panel.
I think it's always great to end on a Daniel and Charles Krauthammer story. We're going to have you sign books now, and I just want to mention to all the good people that are here, they all look like potential docents, and our docents have a table set up out in the hallway there. We have more people coming than ever, more programs than ever, because you're attending them all. We'd love to have you talk to them about possibly joining our wonderful team here at the Richard Nixon.
Well, let me just say that this place has always opened its arms to me, and it has really been a pleasure to come here. It's an honor to talk to you all. Today, on this day, I found out that we opened at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list.
Thank you, everyone.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bret. Thank you so much.